welcome to the Festival of Storytellers.
I can't tell you how excited I am to be on right now. It's been a couple of weeks of excitement, getting prepared, and I've done a lot of things in my life, but this has got to be close to the top.
Thank you, Reader's Magnet, and thank you, John, for putting this forth and taking the chance on us authors in presenting this out to the world.
I've enjoyed this immensely, Joanne.
Ellie, so have I. Thank you for who you are, and thank you, Reader's Magnet. You all are beautiful, and you've worked so very hard, and we are blessed.
We are.
I thank everybody that's involved with this process, because we know writers need readers and writers need publishers. We thank Reader's Magnet and everybody that's involved. I love Reader's Magnet. They say, we share your stories with the world.
Hello, everybody. I'm not sure where you are in the world, but I am Jenny Ferns, and I am in Florida right now, beautiful, sunny Florida. And this is where I came to retire. And I grew up in England. You may tell that from my accent. So I have a British accent, and I moved to Canada, and now I'm in the United States. And I decided that when I had time, that I would write a memoir. So I started this, and I started, way back from my birth and my parents. And then as I was writing, I realized that I might be talking about some people who were still alive and might be a little bit upset about some things that I might say about them. There were actually some secrets and some skeletons in the closet that began to kind of rattle. So I thought, okay, I won't write a memoir which is all about me and the truth of my family. So I thought I'd write a fiction, because that became much easier. So I made a story that was very loosely based on my family, from the stories that my parents told me and of my own life growing up in England. So I created a story. It's actually in 3 parts, but I've only actually published the first part. And it's called Ripple Effect Because of the War. And that's my cover. And it is the story of the effect of the Second World War on a family. So it's not about all the fighting and the blood and gore. It's about actually the fighting and the happiness and the sadness and all the trials and tribulations of a family before the First World War, during the war, and after the war. So it became a real story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The characters were kind of loosely based on people I knew, and the events were based on historical facts and also just events that I made up as well. But the basic story is set in a historical, real setting in England, in London, in a small town called Painswick, just outside London, and in Birmingham. And those are places where I grew up, so I knew the settings. And because it was a historical fiction, was based in a historical time, some of it was before the war, before I was born, I did a lot of research so I would get the dates right, the places right, the events right. And I did a lot of research with that. use Wikipedia and newspaper cuttings, articles, pictures. So I knew what people were wearing at that time, what the customs were, what the music was at that time. And so I created the background that was very authentic based on my knowledge and my experience and my research. So that it is a historical novel based on that period of time before, during, and after the Second World War in England. And there are various themes throughout the story and various curious characters, very interesting characters, some of which I created and some were loosely based on my family. So it begins with a man and a woman who fell in love. So it's a bit of romance in there before the war started, and then they got married because that there was a lot of emotional pressure, and you get married before the war, so the soldier goes off feeling happy, and the woman will hopefully stay faithful. So before the war, set in London, and that was a time between the First World War and the Second World War, and it was a time where women were beginning to work and become independent. And so when the men actually went to war, the women, who were already beginning to use their muscles and feel their independence, they began to be really strong women, and they took over a lot of the jobs that the men left vacant when they went to the war. So we had city women who went into the farmlands and milked cows and mucked out the pigsties and fed the chickens and all that kind of thing, doing work that they would not have normally done if they were, stay-at-home moms or working in stores. They got dirty, and they had to be strong, and they became strong, and so that's what some of the women did. Some of the other women actually went to work in factories, making guns and tanks and things like that, new munitions factories in London and some of the industrial areas in England. And other women stayed home to take care of their families, but also to learn how to, grow vegetables and be self-sufficient, because a lot of the food coming into London was stopped because of the battle in the Channel, and the boats weren't able to come from Europe bringing a lot of fresh produce. So they had to grow a lot of their own. And that's not dissimilar from what was happening in America at that time. Once the Americans joined the war, then very much the same thing happened with the women there. They took over the jobs, and they grew victory farms, victory gardens to get more food for their families. So there is a lot of similarity between what was happening in England at that time and what was happening in Europe, but this is specifically set in England. Nice from here today, says Miss Rice. Nice to hear from you. If you have any questions, please pop them in there and I'll try and answer. Okay, Grace. Hi, Jenny. Great book. Do you think someone could be a writer if they don't feel emotion strongly? Well, that's an interesting question. It depends what the subject of your writing is. If you're pretty intellectual and factual, you might write a factual story. If you're creative and you have some hidden emotions inside, you'll be surprised what comes out when you start writing. Depends what you want to write. Anybody can write. It depends what your subject is. So let me go back to my story. Where was I? All right, talking about independent women. All right, so when the women were left behind for many, many years when the men went to war, and this particular character in my book, he was in the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and he was stationed in Africa for many years. So that was a long way away. You couldn't come home at the weekend. So their wife here, she was actually stayed in the countryside and took in one child who was evacuated from London. Now, what the government did at that time, which was very smart, they decided all the women and children should be evacuated from London when there was a threat of the Germans bombing London, and then the Germans did. It was called the London Blitz, where it was blitzed. All these bombs practically destroyed certain parts of London, particularly the industrial areas. So there was a decree that the children and mothers should leave London, and they were evacuated into the countryside or other towns away from the industrial centers that were, the targets for the bombing. So the character in my book, she took in a child who was evacuated, and this child actually was her sister's child, and the sister was a single mother, but the single mother was stayed behind to work, and she was happy that her child could go and stay with her aunt in the countryside. So she was evacuated. So this little girl, we follow this little girl as well, and the relationship between her and her mother, without any, a father around, and how they grew together, grew to love each other, and how the child was safe in the country and enjoyed the country life, riding around in bicycles, getting dirty, fishing, all that kind of stuff that a lot of kids can't do now. But anyway, she was doing that. And it was a time when children were free. It was very hard for those children. It was very hard. They left their homes. Their fathers were off in the war. They went off to be billeted in other people's homes and away from London. And the London accent, if you grew up in the central London, is very pronounced. It's a Cockney accent. I have a different kind of accent. I wasn't born in the center of London. So these children were taken with a very strange accent to other parts of England, and a lot of people didn't understand them. And a lot of these children were also from the slums and were in quite a lot of poverty. So they went into homes that were more affluent, homes that could afford to take in extra children. So they had to adapt to a different kind of lifestyle and to different people. Yeah, it was hard. And they were away from London for many years. Oh, we've got a question. What would be the best approach to help someone stop drinking? Well, okay, that's a big question. And I'm sure you bring that up because when people come back from the war, we hadn't got to that point yet, but when people do come back from the war, they very often do have post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. In those times back in England, when people suffered from the trauma of war, it was called shell shock, or and the men often felt very ashamed that they were having nightmares and they were having angry issues, and that they were scared, and that they were falling to pieces. And very often drinking was one of the ways in which they thought they could handle it, to kind of drown their sorrows, as it were, after having seen so many horrible things. And this is the same now as back then. People come back from the war, and alcohol is one big issue. Also, drug addiction has become more of an issue as well nowadays, because drugs are being much more available than they were back then. Alcohol was usually the biggest drug that was used. And the first thing is to admit that there's a problem. And very often alcoholics won't want to do that. So they either have to hit bottom and almost kill themselves, or get into such a terrible fight, or something bad has to happen. It's always called hitting bottom. And then maybe they will accept that they need some help. Sometimes it's a medical issue. Sometimes it's an emotional issue. AA is very good. AA began back in London at about this time, just after the war. And that was a big help for some of those returning veterans. As it is here in the United States, where I live now, AA is very important. Also, And the support of everybody else around you, having a sponsor in AA, and also having a private therapist is very, very important, especially for the nightmares and the trauma dealing with that, because there's various ways in which those traumas can be softened in the brain and get the brain and the body more regulated. In my past, I was a psychologist, and I did deal with people with alcoholism and with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so that's in the book, where the hero at the beginning of the book, who was a wonderful, handsome man, very friendly, very outgoing, very loving with his new partner, and then returns and it becomes angry and violent and with nightmares and began to drink and was difficult to live with. And that was in the story, and about how the family dealt with that and how that little girl dealt with that, how she became scared of him. Miss Rice says, your book will teach us how to appreciate more about life and value the freedom we're all enjoying now. Oh, absolutely. Yes. If people go through, I mean, we're all so thankful for all these people who put their lives on the line to save their own countries and to save other people's countries. I mean, the Americans, when they joined in, they were saving all these other countries and all these other cultures, and the Second World War would never have ended without them. The Brits in this story, they were spread around and worked with the Americans to try and stop that terrible tyrant taking over all these countries. And the same thing is happening in Ukraine right now. We have somebody just walking into the Russians just walking into Ukraine saying, hey, we want this. And the devastation is just the same. And the trauma to all those families, the destruction that's all around them all the time. There's families that are leaving. It's just the same. And there will be a lot of trauma, and a lot of people who are going to be struggling with that. So in this book, I have some stories about the everyday life when it's relatively peaceful, and then some chapters which is about the bombing of London and how people survive through that, and then what it's like when people come home, when the men come home, and what it's like to integrate back into society and what it's like for them. And again, that's the same in any military family, anybody who's gone to war. Here in the United States, we've had, so many wars and so many people who've been wounded and so many families that have been disrupted. And fortunately, there's lots of support now for them, but the PTSD is still a big issue. And one of the issues from that is suicide. It's very common when people are not dealing with their issues and not dealing with their addictions, and they're not fitting in with society, and their families are falling to pieces, and their life seems to be falling to pieces. So suicide seems the only option. And I have a little bit of that in the book. That's the bottom that the one character hits here. And I take him through some therapy, and he gets some treatment, and there is some hope. So that is in the story. But there's also the everyday life of a family. And the little girl that I mentioned earlier, who was evacuated, she lived in the country for a while, and then their family moved into another city. She grew up, and I have her growing up being like a normal teenager at that time until she was 18. That's when the book finishes with her at 18. And the added interest in the story here is about her life, her relationship with the boyfriends, and her relationship with her mother and her father, and how she was dealing with his issues. And also about how she dealt with the fact that she was adopted. She never knew that she was adopted until 18, when her biological mother showed up. So the woman who adopted her, who was actually her aunt, did not tell her when she was a little girl that she was adopted. So this little girl thought all along that her aunt was her mother, called her mother and everything. And then her biological mother showed up. And that caused a lot of strain and tension and anger in the family and despair. And just the beginning of acceptance of this new person into her life. And so back in those days, there were a lot of illegitimate children born during the war to British women who had little flings with the American soldiers or other soldiers. The men, when their husbands weren't around, or they were single. So there were some illegitimate children born, and this child here was one. So she was adopted by her aunt. And in those days, adoption was very simple, but the documents were sealed so that the child and the mother did not know about where each of them were. So this story also shows how it's really important for children to know that they're adopted at an early age, depending whatever age they are, and to have the access to find out where their biological mother is and father. And that's something that is very important for people to know now, and to accept that it's important for their children to be able to find out who their mother was, and for the mother to be able to find out what's happened to their child. So that is something that has developed over the past few years, where these secret adoptions or private adoptions or just adoptions in general, they were sealed, but now they're able to be opened, and they realize that that's a good thing for children. So in the book, I am challenging, the ideas about adoption and how it's a good thing for children to know about that. So let's see what else. So in this story, it's not all gloom and doom. In the beginning part, it's sort of a romance, and the beginning of the relationship. In the middle part, there's another romance. There's a little bit of a wartime romance between the woman, the heroine, who is left for years and years and years. Her husband's away, and she falls in love and has a little fling, which comes to an end when her husband returns, and she doesn't tell him. It's one of the secrets. Possibly that's one of the secrets in my family's closet that I didn't really want to bring out. But that is something that happened, and people deal with that. Hello, somebody's asked me a question. What do you owe the real people upon whom you base your characters? Well, there are two people who are still alive. And I would say, thank you so much for the stories you told me that inspired me to write somebody who is fairly similar to you, but not actually you. So I've taken some of your good qualities and put them into one of these characters. And without your stories, I wouldn't have been able to have done that. So I would thank those ones who are not with me anymore. And there is one person in particular who I would hope would read my book. Somebody who was adopted and had trouble adjusting to the fact that there was a biological mother there, and that person did not accept it and did not want anything to do with her. So that's a shame, but that's their right. They didn't. If they don't want to, they don't want to. That's an interesting question. What do I owe people who inspired me? Just a lot of thanks. And hopefully they can see a little pieces of themselves in there and also say, hey, that's not me. Because I embellished some of the characters and made the ones that had some more negative aspects. I made them a lot more negative than they were in real life. Let's see. So people might also understand a little bit about what everyday life was like in London. I mean, that the day-to-day living standards in England at that time and until fairly recently was definitely not the standard that we have in North America now, in Canada or North America where I live now. For example, when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, in an everyday home, just a normal middle-class home, there was no central heating. Okay, we didn't have like extreme winters like in the north of North America, like no deep freeze for months and months, but it was cold. It was cold and damp. So we had fires, but they were open fires. We had one fire in the house, which was a coal fire, big black chunks of coal that you would light with kindling, and you'd light it at the end of the day when everybody came home from school or work. And for myself, I was usually the first person home from school when I was about 10 or 11. My parents were working. My mother worked, of course, because that's what women began to do. And I would come home and light the coal fire. It would be freezing and it would gradually warm up. By the time my parents came home, it was warm and it was toasty in the downstairs area. And that fire was kept alight until it died down when everybody went to bed. The house was relatively warm, but the upstairs would be coldish. And if you really wanted it to be warm, you had a little bar electric fire to warm you up. So coal fires were there for quite a long time until there was something called the Clean Air Act, where coal fires were outlawed and you had to use smokeless fuel and a special stove to use it. And people weren't allowed to have open coal fires. And then people began to have central heating and it's more electric powered. So that was something in my life. Some sort of traditions in Britain are kind of interesting, probably for people in North America or other countries. Tea time. Tea time was if you went to visit somebody for tea time. Do I have other writers in my family? No, I don't have other writers in my family. I have readers. My father was a very avid reader, and he had a big library, and that's probably where I got my avid reading from. And I think if you are a writer, you really have to be a reader. If you're going to be writing fiction or really writing anything, I think you have to be a reader. You have to have read a variety of books of all different genres. I mean, this is historical fiction, but there are all kinds of other genres, like romances and supernatural stuff, and also nonfiction. So if you're a reader, you begin to learn about other people's lives and you get inside other people's heads. Kind of like watching a movie, but I think in writing, you actually get inside people's heads a lot deeper than just watching a movie. You have to guess a lot about sometimes what they're thinking. So if you're a writer, you get to get inside so many different characters' heads, so many different situations in so many different parts of the world. I mean, when I was growing up, I read, Jane Austen was one of the basic ones. But then later on, I read some of the Russian authors like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. And through those eyes and through that, I got to learn about a different cultures that I never would have learned in school, in high school. So books are really, really important to get to understand people, different cultures, different countries. I've learned so much about China and about Africa through reading books. And you don't have to travel to those lands to necessarily understand what's going on there and to have empathy for those people. But if you read a book and get inside people's lives and their stories, that makes you, I think, a better person and helps you to understand other people, develops empathy. And hopefully in my book, you can develop empathy yourself for the people going through tough times, through good times, what happens when they fall down and scrape their knee, as it were, and how they grow and develop. And it helps you understand people. So hopefully that's one of the things that people will get from this book, understanding not only the British way of life, like having tea time, cups of tea, and you have a teapot and a tea cozy, and you have a cup of tea, and you put milk in first. This is hot tea, and you put in some sugar, and you sit down and you talk, and you will probably have a slice of sponge cake or what we call biscuits in England. That it will be in North America you call it a cookie, but in England they call biscuits, which of course is very different thing than in North America. And so the tea time is a very special time for sitting and visiting. And coffee wasn't something that the Brits were using, not back then. 1 minute left. Okay. I really recommend you to buy my book. You can get it on Amazon. And please, if you purchase my book, whether it's a Kindle or a soft or a hardcover, and you read it, please give me a review. Reviews are very, very important for people to get an idea whether other people like the book, what they like about it, what they've learned from it, and whether it's something that they will want to look at. Whenever I buy something like a refrigerator, I always look at the reviews to see, what works. So Amazon has my book, and please type in ripple effect because of the war. There are other people who write something about ripple effects, but probably about rippling muscles or something. But Amazon has the book, and please purchase that. And if you want to give a review, I'd love that. If you want to look at my website, jennyfernswriter.com, or you can send me an email, jennyfernswriter@gmail.com, and I'd love to hear from you. And thank you very much to Reader's Magnet for giving me a chance to talk about my work, and hopefully to have more readers or inspire more writers to write. It's fun, it's challenging, and it's definitely worth it. Pleasure talking to you. Have a great day.